The cold woke her before the clock did, the way it always did in January, creeping in along the floorboards and up through the feather bed until it found the bare skin of her throat. Marit lay still a moment in the dark, listening. Somewhere under the quilts, Anders breathed slow and even beside her, and beyond the wall, the byre was silent, which meant the cows were still lying down, which meant she had woken early even for herself. Good. She liked these few minutes before the house asked anything of her. She reached one hand from under the covers to touch the window glass and drew it back at once. Frost had grown across the pane in the night, a whole forest of it. Ferns and feathers laid one over another in white, and through the clear rim at the very top, she could see that the sky was still black, crowded with more stars than she could ever find room for in the summer months, when the nights barely troubled themselves to grow dark at all. Down in the valley in December and January, the sun did not climb over the eastern ridge until mid-morning, and by early afternoon it had already dropped behind the western one again, so that the whole of the short day was really only a long gray hour stretched thin between two darknesses. She had stopped minding it years ago. It gave the day a shape, at least. You knew where you stood in it. She swung her legs out from under the quilt and felt for her stockings on the chair where she had left them, still faintly warm from being tucked near the stove the night before, a small mercy she never forgot to arrange. The floor itself was another matter, cold enough to make her hiss through her teeth as her bare feet found the boards for the half-second before the wool stockings covered them, and then the underskirt, and then the heavy wadmal skirt over that, her arms finding the sleeves of her bodice by feel alone in the dark, buttons fumbled more than seen. Anders stirred, turned, one arm coming free of the blankets and finding nothing where she had been. "Already," he said, not really a question, his voice thick with sleep. "Already," she answered, and pulled the shawl from its peg and wound it twice about her shoulders. "The fire wants building before the children are up, or Barrett will come down complaining of her fingers again, and I have not the patience for it this morning." He gave a low sound that might have been agreement, or might have been only the sound a man makes when he intends to sleep another quarter hour, and she left him to it. There was no need for two of them to be cold at once. The passage outside their room ran the length of the house, unheated, and she crossed it quickly, her breath showing pale even indoors, the whole building holding the night's chill in its thick log walls, the way a stone holds the cold of a cellar. Old Kirstein's door stood open a crack, and from within came the steady small sound of the old woman's sleep, untroubled, unhurried. She would rise when the smell of the stove reached her, and not a moment before, and no one in the house begrudged her that after 60 winters of rising first. Down the narrow stair Marit went, one hand trailing the wall for guidance more than support, and into the main room where the stove crouched black and cold in its corner, the fire from the evening before long since sunk to nothing. She knelt before it in the dark, working by touch and long habit, clearing yesterday's ash into the pail, laying the birch bark and the fine dry kindling she had split and set aside for precisely this hour, striking the match and cupping the small flame with her hand until it caught and held. The bark curled and spat and brightened, throwing sudden orange light across the room, across the rose-mailed cupboard in the corner, with its painted scrolls of red and blue that Anders's grandmother had commissioned from a traveling painter decades before anyone now living could properly remember, across the long table scrubbed pale with sand and use, across the row of copper pots on their shelf, catching the new light and giving it back doubled. The room seemed to wake with the fire, the shadows drawing back into the corners where they belonged. She fed in the split birch logs one after another until the fire held steady on its own, then set the great iron kettle over the hottest part of the stovetop and stood a moment simply warming her hands, palms out, feeling the blood come back into her fingers. Outside, through the log walls, she heard the byre stir at last, a low sound from one of the cows, a shift of weight, hooves on packed earth, and she knew the day had properly begun now, whether she was ready for it or not. It was never really a question of ready. The animals did not ask. While the kettle came to its boil, she measured coffee into the pot, the beans already ground the night before, so as not to wake the house with the grinder's rattle, and the smell of it began to fill the room, dark and bitter, and somehow more comforting than the fire itself. Coffee was not a thing taken lightly in this house, nor in any house in the valley that she knew of. It was poured strong, drunk scalding, taken again and again through the day at every pause in the work, and a guest who declined a cup was a guest who meant to give offense. Her own mother had told her once that a house without coffee in the pot was a house not properly awake, and Marit had never found reason to doubt it. She let the ground settle, poured a cup for herself standing at the stove, and felt the warmth of it travel down through her chest like something almost alive. She was still holding the cup when she heard Anders's feet on the stair, dressed now, his wool jacket buttoned to the throat, and behind him the smaller, quicker footsteps of Ola, 7 years old and already dressed himself after a fashion, shirt only half tucked, hair standing up on one side where the pillow had left it. "Is there coffee?" Anders said, which was not really a question either, and she poured him a cup and watched him drink half of it, standing before he had even properly opened his eyes. "You'll want the lantern," she told him. "It won't be light for 2 hours yet." "I know the way to my own byre in the dark," he said, but he took the lantern from its hook by the door all the same and lit it from a taper at the stove. And Ola took up the smaller one without being asked, because fetching water and helping with the calves had been his particular pride since the autumn, when Anders had first judged him old enough to be useful rather than simply underfoot. Marit pulled her shawl tighter and followed them out, because the milking wanted 3 pairs of hands on a morning like this one, with Kirstine's knees troubling her too much these days to manage the stool, and because she would rather do the work in company than send the men out alone into that black cold while she stayed within. The yard, when she opened the door, struck her the way it always did, a wall of cold air so sharp it seemed to have an edge to it, and the snow underfoot cried out beneath her boots with that high, dry creak that only came on the coldest mornings, a sound like a question asked and never answered. Overhead, the stars had not dimmed at all. The dwelling house behind her showed one lit window, low and orange. Ahead, across the trampled path, the byre's low log shape crouched dark under its heavy cap of snow, and beyond that the stabber stood up on its 4 stone-capped posts, silvered with frost, holding through the winter everything the summer had given them. She could see her own breath go up in a pale column before her face and dissolve. Inside the byre it was another world entirely, not warm precisely, but close and thick, with the smell of hay and animal and dung, the cows' bodies themselves giving off a heat that gathered under the low roof and made the whole space feel after the yard almost gentle. The lantern light swung and settled, throwing huge soft shadows of horns and haunches up the timber walls. 3 cows stood in their stalls, and beyond them the horse, Brunnen, turned his head at the sound of the door and blew out through his nose, and along the far wall the sheep shifted together in a gray woolly mass, unbothered, waiting only for their hay. Anders went first to Brunnen, running a hand down the horse's neck, speaking to him in the low, unhurried voice men seem to keep, especially for animals, while Ola climbed onto the hay to begin forking down the morning's feed exactly as he had been shown, counting under his breath the way he always did, as though the hay might otherwise come to less than it should. Marit took the milking stool from its nail and set it beside the nearest cow, old Rosa, patient and slow and marked white across one flank, and pressed her forehead against the warm hide the way she had done every morning for 9 years now, since she had first come to this farm as a bride not yet 20, and had known almost nothing of milking at all. Her hands knew the work now without her needing to think of it, the rhythm of it settling into her shoulders and wrists, the thin, bright ring of milk striking the pail, changing its note as the pail filled from a high, tinny sound to something rounder and softer, almost like a hum. Rosa shifted her weight and sighed, a great gusting animal sigh, and went on chewing. Marit rested her cheek a moment against the cow's flank, feeling the slow working of ribs beneath the hide, the heat of it soaking into her own cold face, and thought, as she often did at this hour, that there was something almost like prayer in it. This quiet, this repetition, the whole world narrowed down to the pail and the warmth and the small sounds of breathing, hers and the animals both. Anders moved to the second cow while she finished the first, and between them the work went quickly, the pails filling, Ola finishing the hay and moving on to fill the water trough from the barrel they kept from freezing solid by breaking its skin of ice each morning with a wooden mallet kept for the purpose. The sheep took their hay with the small contented murmuring sound sheep always made, a sound she had never minded, unlike the sharper complaints of hungry hens, though they kept no hens through the deep winter months, having judged years ago that it was not worth the grain to keep birds through a season when they gave so little back for it. When the last pail was full and covered, Anders straightened and rolled his shoulders, and in the lantern light she saw his breath and hers mingling above the warmth of the byre floor. Rosa's milk is thinner than it was in the autumn, he said, running a thumb along the rim of the pail, considering it the way he considered most things, without hurry. She's dry within the month, I'd think, Marit said. She always slows before she stops giving. We'll manage. There's cheese enough put by, and the mutton besides. He said it easily, without weight, the way a man says a thing he has already thought through and settled in his own mind, and she nodded because it was true, and because there was no use turning a plain fact into a worry when it did not ask to be one. The stabber held what the summer and autumn had given them, the flat bread stacked in its great dry rounds, the salted fish, the cured mutton hanging from the rafters, the tubs of butter, the wheels of cheese, including the small brown ones, sweet and dense, that Kirsten made each year from the last of the way, and that Ola loved beyond all other food, and it would hold through to spring as it always had. They carried the pails back across the yard together, Ola trotting ahead with the lantern held a little too high so that it swung wild shadows across the snow, and behind them, low along the eastern ridge, The sky had begun at last to change, not lightening exactly, not yet, but losing some fraction of its blackness, going the deep blue-gray of a stone at the bottom of a stream. Marit paused a moment at the door to look at it before going in. It would be another hour at least before the sun troubled itself to appear over the ridge, and by early afternoon it would be gone behind the western mountains again. But for now, even that faint promise of gray was welcome, a sign that the day, such as it was, intended to arrive. Inside, the house had warmed considerably in their absence, the stove ticking and creaking as the iron expanded, and Kirstine was up at last, moving about the kitchen in her own unhurried fashion, her gray hair already pinned, a shawl crossed over her chest and knotted behind. She was straining the fresh milk through a cloth into the big earthen crocks, and she looked up as they came in, stamping the snow from their boots. "Rosa slowing?" she asked, without needing to be told, only from the weight of the pail Anders set down. "Dry within the month," Anders said, hanging the lantern back on its hook. "She always was an October cow at heart," Kirstine said, which meant nothing to anyone but herself and perhaps the cow, and she went back to her straining with the small satisfaction of a woman whose judgment on such matters had never once, in living memory, been proven wrong. Marit set a pot of the sour milk porridge she had started the evening before back onto the stove to warm through, and cut thick slices from the round of flatbread kept wrapped in a cloth by the hearth, soft still from being kept near the warmth, rather than out in the stabber's cold with the rest of the store. She spread butter on the slices, a good thick scrape of it, pale yellow and slightly grainy the way farm butter was in winter, and set out the pot of sour cream to be eaten alongside, and more coffee, always more coffee, the pot never quite empty, from the moment the fire was lit until the moment it was banked again at night. It was the smell of it all, more than any sound, that finally brought the children down. Ola, already there, of course, seated and swinging his legs under the table with the particular restlessness of a boy who has already done a morning's work and considers himself owed his breakfast promptly, and then Barrett, 4 years old, appearing at the top of the stair in her nightdress with her hair every which way, blinking at the light and the warmth as though she had not expected either to be real. "It's cold," she announced, as if this were news to anyone in the room. "It is," Marit agreed, and lifted her down the last 2 steps and set her on the bench close by the stove, tucking a shawl about her small shoulders before she had even properly finished complaining. "Eat, and you'll be warmer for it." Barrett ate in the deliberate, suspicious way she approached most food before midday, more interested for a while in dragging her spoon through the porridge than in eating it, until Ola, with the easy superiority of an older brother, told her that the cows had already had their breakfast and she oughtn't to fall behind a cow, which struck Barrett as such an alarming thought that she set to properly at once. Anders caught Marit's eye across the table, and something passed between them that needed no words at all. The small private amusement of 2 people who had built a household together and found, most mornings, that it amused them. They ate together at the long table by the light of the stove and one tallow candle, the window still black behind its lace of frost, the room smelling of coffee and warm butter and the faint sweet must of the porridge, and for a while no one spoke much, because there was no need to, because the food was good and the room was warm, and the day's real work had not yet properly begun. By the time the last cup was drunk, a thin gray light had finally begun to show at the window's clear edge, enough to make the candle flame look suddenly small and unnecessary, and Anders pushed back from the table with the air of a man whose morning had a shape already fixed in his mind. There was wood to bring in from the stack by the tree line, he said. The supply by the door grown low, and the path to the upper hayshed wanted checking too, since the wind in the night might have drifted snow across it deep enough to trouble a sledge. He would take Ola, who received this news with the particular solemn pride of a boy asked along on a man's errand rather than sent off to a child's one, and was into his outer coat and reaching for his skis before Marit had even finished clearing the bowls. She stood a moment at the window, scraping a coin-sized patch clear of frost with her thumbnail, and through it watched them go. Anders breaking trail with long, even strides, the skis hissing softly over the crust of the snow, Ola following in the track his father left, small and determined, falling once and coming up laughing before he had even properly registered that he'd fallen. The sky above the ridge had gone the color of a duck's egg now, pale, tinged with blue, though the sun itself was still an hour or better from clearing the mountain shoulder. She watched them until the trees took them, then let the curtain of frost close back over her small clear patch and turned to the day's work. The house did not run itself, and a morning's indoor labor in January was not so very different from a morning's labor in July, only conducted indoors and by lamp instead of daylight. She cleared the table and set the bowls to soak, swept the floor of the worst of the snow the men had tracked in, and set Kirstina's wool basket by the good chair near the stove, for the old woman's hands, however her knees troubled her, had lost none of their skill at the carding combs, and she would sit there through the better part of the morning, drawing the raw fleece into soft, even rolls, ready for the spinning wheel that stood always in the corner like a patient, waiting friend. Barrett was given a task of her own, small and mostly ceremonial, winding a ball of yarn from a skein Kirstein held stretched between her two hands, a job that made the child feel enormously useful and kept her out from underfoot for the better part of half an hour, which was, in truth, the greater part of its purpose. Marit, meanwhile, filled the great copper pot with snow carried in from the drift by the door, for even with the well, melted snow was easier come by on a morning this cold, and set it on the stove to become, slowly, the day's water, for washing and cooking both. The snow hissed and sank and blackened a little at the pot's edge where it touched the iron, and the smell of hot metal and melting snow mixed with the last of the coffee smell still hanging in the room. She thought, stirring the pot of the day ahead, nothing in it that had not been in 100 days before it, and she found she did not mind that in the least. There was a comfort in a day whose shape she already knew before it had properly happened, the wool to be spun, the midday meal to be got up from what the stabber offered, the second milking before dark, the mending that never quite ran out. It was not an exciting life, she thought, or had not seemed one when she was a girl in her father's house, dreaming of a wider world beyond the ridge lines. But it was a full one, each hour fitted close against the next like the timbers of the house itself, and she had come, in 9 winters, to find something like peace in that closeness. It was Barrett who first noticed the sun, abandoning her yarn ball with a small cry, and pressing her whole face to the one window not yet fogged by the room's warmth. "It's come," she said, as though the sun were a visitor arriving late and much anticipated, which in a sense it was. Marit came to look over her shoulder, and there it stood at last, a low golden disk, balanced for a moment on the very notch of the eastern ridge, throwing a long, thin wash of light down across the snow of the yard, gilding the top of the stabour's shingled roof, catching the frost on every fence post and turning the whole white world briefly, dazzlingly bright. It would not climb high. In a Norwegian valley in January, the sun did not so much rise as sidle along the tops of the mountains, a guest who stayed only long enough to be seen and then withdrew again. But for the hour or two it granted them, the light poured gold and low and level through every south-facing window in the house, and even Kirstine paused over her carding to enjoy it. The dogs down the valley set up a distant barking not long after, which in this country was as good as a bell rung at the door, and sure enough, within the quarter hour came the creak of a sledge runner on packed snow, and the jingle of a harness bell, and Marit looked out to see Inga Haugen from the next farm down, well wrapped in her heaviest shawl, driving her own small sledge along the track between the two properties with a covered basket beside her on the seat. She had come, it turned out, once she was inside and settled with a cup of coffee pressed into her hands, mostly for the pleasure of an hour's talk, though she had brought besides a length of blue ribbon she'd traded for at the last market and thought Barrett might like for her hair, and news that old Halvor at the mill farm had received a letter from his son in America not a fortnight past, the first in nearly a year, full of talk of the flat wide land out in Minnesota, and a photograph besides, the boy standing stiff and unfamiliar in a borrowed collar in front of a house twice the size of anything in the valley. "He looked well," Inga said, turning her cup in her hands, "fatter in the face than when he left, which his mother took as a very great comfort." "They always do look well in the photographs," Kirstine said, not unkindly, only with the dry practicality of a woman who had seen a good many such letters arrive over the years, from this farm and that one both, sons and daughters, gone out to the wide country across the water, and had learned to take the good news for what it was, a genuine gladness, without pretending the valley did not feel the smaller for their going. Marit's own cousin Sigrid had written from the Dakota country only that autumn, a long, cheerful letter full of description. The astonishing flatness of the land, wheat instead of hay, a church raised new out of raw lumber, where a Norwegian sermon was preached every second Sunday, and the letter sat still, folded, in the drawer of the cupboard, to be read aloud again some evening soon when the mood for it came round. They talked another quarter hour of small things, whose cow had calved early, whose loom needed a new heddle, the likelihood of more snow before the week was out. And then Inga rose, refused a second cup only because the light would not hold forever and she'd her own byre to see to, and was bundled back into her sledge and away down the track with a last wave, the harness bell fading into the general quiet of the valley until it was gone altogether. With the visit ended, Marit turned her mind properly to the midday meal and took the lantern out to the stabour to see what the day would offer. Climbing the little ladder to its raised door, set up on posts and capped stones, the way every stabber in the valley was built, high enough that no mouse nor damp could trouble what was stored within. She felt the change of air at once, colder even than outside, dry and still and faintly resinous, with the smell of the pine timber itself, mixed with the deeper smells of everything kept there, the smoked and salted mutton hanging in dark-cured legs from the rafters, the great stacked rounds of flatbread wrapped in cloth, sacks of potatoes and barley, the crocks of butter, the pale wheels of cheese, and beside them the small brown ones Kirstine made from boiled-down whey, sweet and firm and the particular pride of the household. She took down a joint of the cured mutton, a good sack of potatoes, a wedge of the ordinary cheese, and climbed back down into the brightness of the low sun with her apron gathered up to carry it all. The mutton wanted long, slow boiling to soften it properly, and she set it on early, the pot filling the kitchen by degrees with a rich, savory steam that even Barrett, absorbed now in some private game with a carved wooden horse on the floor by the stove, looked up to sniff appreciatively. Marit peeled potatoes at the table while it cooked, the knife turning in a long unbroken ribbon the way her own mother had taught her, dropping them into a second pot of the melted snow water, and Kirstine, her carding finished for the morning, moved to the loom in the far corner and began the slow rhythmic work of weaving, the shuttle passing and the beater falling with a sound like a heartbeat, slowed down, steady and unhurried, filling the room's quiet with something that was not quite noise and not quite silence either. Anders and Ola came in not long before the meal was ready, stamping snow from their boots in the entryway, cheeks reddened deep by the cold, both of them smelling of pine sap and clean winter air. The path to the hay shed had drifted, Anders reported, but not so badly it couldn't be managed with the sledge, and they'd brought in besides a good load of split wood, stacked now by the door high enough to see the household through several days without another trip. Ola had things to say, too, delivered all in a rush. A hare's tracks crossing the trail clean as writing, a woodpecker they'd heard working somewhere off in the trees, though never seen, the particular excellent crunch of the snow crust in the shadowed places where the sun hadn't reached it. And Marit listened to all of it while she set the table, because a boy's account of his morning was, she had found, very often the best part of her own. They ate at midday with the low sun still slanting gold through the south window, the mutton fallen soft from the pot, the potatoes split open and pale and starchy, butter melting into them, the cheese and flatbread set alongside for whoever wanted more, and coffee again after, always coffee, poured and drunk standing as often as sitting, a small warm ceremony repeated so many times a day that no one in the house could have said with certainty how many cups had passed through their hands since dawn. Outside already, though it was scarcely past noon, the light had begun its long, slow retreat back toward the western ridge, and Marit, catching sight of it through the window as she cleared the table, felt no sorrow in its going. The day had given what it meant to give. The rest of it belonged to the lamp. The afternoon settled into the particular texture that winter afternoons always took on in this house, once the meal was cleared and the low sun had begun its retreat behind the western peaks. A texture made almost entirely of hands at work and voices pitched low over that work, the whole room drawn in close around the stove as the light outside thinned toward gray. Marit brought out the spinning wheel and sat before it with a basket of Kirstine's morning carding at her side, and began the long, familiar motion, foot working the treadle, fingers drawing the wool out even and fine between thumb and forefinger, feeding it to the spindle's hungry turning. It was work that asked just enough of the mind to keep it from wandering too far, and just little enough to let it wander some, And she found herself thinking, as the wheel hummed its low, steady note, of the coming spring, still months off, but never entirely out of mind even in the depth of January. The fields going green again, the cows out to pasture, the light coming back by degrees until the whole valley seemed to remember all at once what daylight was for. Anders had settled at the end of the table with a coil of harness leather and his tools, working a cracked strap back into soundness with an awl and a patient, unhurried thoroughness, and beside him, on a low stool near enough the stove to catch its warmth, Ola was set to carving, a task Anders had begun teaching him that autumn with a blunt knife and a block of soft pine. And though the boy's effort so far amounted to little more than a lopsided horse's head, he bent over it now with the fierce concentration of a craftsman twice his age. Berit, tired at last of her wooden toy, climbed up beside Kirstine at the loom to watch the shuttle fly, and Kirstine, without pausing her weaving, told her in a low, even voice about the rose mailing on the cupboard in the corner, how her own mother-in-law had had it done the year the new king was crowned. The painter, come all the way from 2 valleys over, with his little pots of red and blue and gold, how he'd stayed a week and eaten them nearly out of butter, how the flowers he'd painted weren't any flower that grew in this valley or any other, but a kind of flower that lived only in paint, sprung whole from a man's imagination and his brush. It was Berit, listening to this, who asked whether Aunt Sigrid's house in America had rose-mailing too. And it was this question, innocent and sideways as children's questions so often were, that put Marit in mind of the letter still folded in the cupboard drawer. She fetched it out before the thought could leave her, and unfolded the thin paper carefully at its worn creases, and read it aloud to the room by the lamp's steady light. Sigrid's careful, looping hand describing the house she and her husband had built on land so flat you could see a rider coming an hour before he arrived, the wheat that grew taller than a man's head come August, the little white church raised of new lumber where a Norwegian sermon was still preached every second Sunday, and where half the valley's old surnames turned up again on other tongues in other mouths. She wrote of missing the mountains sometimes, in an idle way, the way one might miss a particular chair, but mostly she wrote of contentment, of a garden she'd planted, of a photograph she meant to send in the spring once she'd had one properly made in the town. Ola wanted to know if Minnesota had snow, and was gravely satisfied to be told that it had a great deal, quite as much as their own valley, which seemed to settle for him some private question about whether America could really be trusted. They sat a while longer in that comfortable, overlapping quiet, the spindle's low hum and the loom's soft percussion and the small scrape of Anders's awl, all running together under the room's one steady lamp, until Marit noticed, glancing up, that the window had gone entirely black again, and that the day, brief as it always was in this season, had quietly closed itself around them without any of them quite marking the moment it happened. The animals did not know or care that the household had spent its afternoon at spinning and carving and old letters, and by 5 o'clock the byre wanted seeing to again, hay to be forked down for the night, the cows milked a second time, the water trough's new skin of ice broken once more before it could thicken, past breaking. Anders rose and stretched and reached for his coat, and this time it was Marit who took up the second lantern without being asked, glad enough of the excuse to stand up from the wheel and set her back straight after the long bent hours of spinning. Ola would have gone too, but his eyes had begun to droop over his carving, the fierce concentration of the afternoon finally spending itself, and Kirstine kept him back by the stove with the promise of first taste of whatever Marit had planned for supper, which struck him as a fair enough trade. Out in the yard, the cold had sharpened further with the full dark, and the snow underfoot had gone from a daytime creak to something harder and higher, almost a squeal, and overhead the stars had come out in their full winter multitude again, close and hard and bright, no moon yet risen to soften them. The byre, when they reached it, gave off its same low animal warmth as it had that morning, welcoming after the black yard, and they worked through the chores with the easy, wordless coordination of two people who had done this exact task together several thousand times before. Anders forking hay, Marit at the stool again with Rosa, and then the second cow, the pails filling with that same bright falling note, changing gradually to a rounder one, the horse Brunnen leaning his long head over the stall rail now and then to see what fuss was being made, and finding, as always, that it did not concern him. "Cold enough to crack a stone tonight," Anders said at one point, not with any complaint in it, only an observation, the kind men in this valley made about weather the way other men might comment on the price of grain, a simple accounting of the facts of the world. "Kirstine says it'll hold clear through the week," Marit said. "Her knee told her so this morning." "Her knee's rarely wrong." "It's rarely right about anything else," Marit said, and Anders laughed, a short, low sound in the lantern-lit dark, and for a moment, kneeling there with her forehead against the cow's warm flank and the pail filling steadily beneath her hands, she felt something she could not have named exactly, but that sat comfortably enough in her chest all the same. Not happiness precisely, nothing so bright or so brief as that word suggested, but a kind of settled rightness, the sense of a life fitted to its place the way a good latch fits its catch, with no wasted motion and no complaint in the closing. They finished the milking and saw the animals bedded down for the night, checked that the byre door was fastened well against the wind that had begun to rise, and carried the pails back across the yard under that vast hard sky, their lanterns swinging small pools of gold light across the blue-white snow. The dwelling-house ahead of them showed its own warm windows now, both downstairs ones lit, and smoke rising straight up from the chimney into the still air before losing itself among the stars. And Marit thought, as she often did on this walk back in the deep cold, that there was no sight in the whole turning year that pleased her quite so much as her own house lit up and waiting for her out of the dark. Inside, Kirstine had kept her promise and had Ola help her set the table, and while Anders strained the fresh milk, Marit turned her attention to supper, which tonight would be remagrut, the thick sour cream porridge that was as much a ceremony in this house as coffee itself, saved most often for the end of a long working day when something warm and rich and unhurried was wanted. She measured the sour cream into the heavy pot and set it over the heat, stirring as it came to a slow boil, watching for the moment. She knew it by sight and smell more than by any clock, when the butterfat would begin to separate and rise, a thin golden layer forming at the surface that had to be skimmed off carefully into a cup and set aside, the whole kitchen filling with a smell rich and sweet and utterly unlike anything else the year produced. Once the fat was drawn off, she stirred in the flour by slow degrees, the porridge thickening beneath her spoon into something smooth and pale, and finally the milk, until it reached the consistency she wanted, neither too thin nor too stiff, and she moved it to the side of the stove to keep warm while she called the household to table. They ate it from bowls with the golden butterfat spooned back over the top in a small pool at the center, and sugar and cinnamon besides for the children, who considered rumagret the finest thing their mother's hands produced in any season, and said so, loudly and often, Ola declaring between mouthfuls that he intended to eat nothing else once he was a man grown with a house of his own, a claim Anders received with the particular grave nod of a father who has heard a great many such declarations from a great many small boys and expects to hear a great many more before this one is through. Barrett ate hers more slowly, watching the butter pool and spread with the same fascination she brought to most things, and asked, halfway through, whether the cows knew that their milk became this, as though there were some thanks owed to Rosa and her sisters that ought to be paid. I expect they'd rather have their hay, Anders told her, straight-faced, and Barrett considered this with great seriousness and appeared, in the end, to accept it as reasonable. Flatbread came alongside, and the last of the mutton broth thickened into a small soup for anyone who wanted it, and coffee again to finish, poured strong and taken slow. The whole meal stretched out longer than it strictly needed to be, because there was nowhere else any of them wished to be, and no reason to hurry a good thing along. Outside, the wind had risen further, not violently, only a steady low push against the timber walls that made the lamp flame lean now and then, and sent a thin whistle along the chimney's edge, a sound the house had made every winter of its long life, and that none of them any longer marked as anything but the ordinary voice of a cold night settling in. The stove ticked as it cooled by degrees from the day's high heat, and the windows had long since gone entirely black, and were beginning to gather their own new coat of frost at the corners, spreading in from the glass toward the center the way it did every night, once the room's warmth stopped fighting it back. By the time the last of the porridge was scraped from the pot and the dishes gathered for washing, Barrett's head had begun to nod over her empty bowl, and even Ola, who would have sworn an hour before that he wasn't the least bit tired, had grown quiet in the particular way that in this house always meant bedtime was close behind, whether he cared to admit it himself or not. Marit took them up herself, a candle in a small tin holder lighting the narrow stair ahead of her, the children's shadows climbing the log wall beside them, huge and wavering, and, to Barrett at least, endlessly entertaining, her small hand rising to make shapes of her fingers against the light, until Marit reminded her gently that shapes could be made just as well lying down. Their room was cold in the way every room but the kitchen was cold in this house come winter, but the beds had been readied with a warming pan drawn along the sheets an hour before, and the feather beds and the good wool blankets, some of them carded and spun and woven by Kirstine's own hands a decade or more past, held the warmth well once a body settled beneath them. She helped Barrett from her daytime clothes into the soft, worn nightdress, and combed out the last tangles from her hair with a few quick, easy strokes, and tucked her into the narrow bed against the wall, drawing the blankets up to her chin and pressing them in at the sides the way the child liked, a small nightly fortification against the cold that crept along the floor. Ola needed less help and accepted less of it, being 7 and increasingly certain of his own competence in such matters, but he let his mother sit on the edge of his bed a moment all the same, and told her, through a yawn, he could not quite suppress, about the hare's tracks again, and the woodpecker, as though the day's small discoveries required one more telling before they could properly be laid to rest alongside him. "Will you tell the one about the troll under the bridge?" Barrett asked, as she asked most nights, the request less a question than a settled part of the evening's order, and Marit, seated between the two beds with the candle throwing its small steady light up across the timbered ceiling, told it again, the old story of the goats and the bridge and the troll beneath it, a tale so worn smooth by repetition in this house that she could have told it in her sleep, and very likely had, on nights when her own tiredness outpaced theirs. Ola, who considered himself rather too old for troll stories these days, listened all the same with his eyes closed and a faint smile at the familiar turns, and Barrett's eyes had gone heavy again before the smallest goat had even crossed the bridge, so that by the story's end, when the troll was sent tumbling into the river below exactly as he always was, exactly as everyone in the room already knew he would be, she was very nearly asleep. Marit sat a moment longer once the story was done, watching the candlelight settle over the two small still shapes in their beds, the room quiet now but for the wind's steady low pressure against the outer wall and a creak of the house settling into the deep cold of the night. Timber and frost finding their old accustomed argument with each other, as they did every winter. She banked no fire in this room. There was none to bank, only the warmth carried up from below and held, however thinly, by good blankets and closed shutters. But she checked the window all the same, the frost already thick across it, and found the room sealed well enough against the night, and drew the door most of the way closed behind her, leaving it open a hand's width the way she always did, so that a little of the kitchen's warmth and light might find its way up the stair to them through the small hours. Downstairs, the house had settled into its last quiet hour, the one Marit privately thought of as her own, though she shared it most nights with Anders, and until she too went up with Kirstine. The old woman had taken up her knitting, needles clicking in a steady, unhurried rhythm as she worked at a sock heel by the lamp, and Anders had gone back to his harness leather for a last half-hour's work before the tools were put away, and Marit sat with her own mending basket, a torn seam of Ola's everyday shirt wanting a needle and thread before morning, the work small and forgiving under her hands after the day's larger labors. The stove had been fed its last good log and would be banked soon, damped down to hold its coals through the night rather than blaze, and already the room's fierce afternoon warmth had begun to soften toward something gentler, the kind of warmth that asked a body to sit still and be grateful for it rather than to work within it. They talked a little, as they always did in this hour, of small, unhurried things, the wood supply, which would want replenishing again within the week, a plan to visit Anders's uncle 2 farms over, come Sunday, weather allowing, whether the blue ribbon Inga had brought would want washing before Barrett wore it, Kirstine's firm opinion being that it would not, having come clean enough from the trader's hands. Anders finished his strap and set his tools back in their box with the particular care of a man who valued his tools nearly as much as what they made, and stretched and allowed that he was for bed himself before too much longer, the morning coming, as mornings in this house always did, whether a man felt ready for it or not. Kirstine finished her row, tucked the needles into the ball of yarn, and rose with a hand pressed briefly to the small of her back, bidding them both a good night in the same plain, unceremonious way she said most things, and made her way toward her own room off the passage, her candle throwing a small moving light ahead of her until the door closed and the light with it. Marit finished her seam not long after, bit the thread, and folded the mended shirt into the basket for morning. Anders banked the fire himself, raking the coals into a low, even bed at the center of the firebox, and covering them with a fine layer of ash, enough to hold their heat through the dark hours without burning away, so that in the morning only a little kindling and a little patience would bring the flame back to life. He closed the damper part way and checked the latch on the outer door, and Marit blew out the lamp, leaving only the last red glow from the stove's grate to mark the shape of the room, the rose-mailed cupboard, the loom, the long table, all of it settling into soft outline and shadow. They climbed the stair together, one candle between them, and paused a moment at the children's door. Berit had turned onto her side at some point in the last hour, one hand curled loose against the pillow, and Ola lay flat on his back, exactly as he always slept, the blankets rising and falling with the slow, even rhythm of a boy who had spent his whole day outdoors in the cold and had nothing left in him to keep awake for. Marit drew the door to its accustomed hand's width and no further, and followed Anders into their own room. The bed was cold when she first slid beneath the covers, the way it always was this deep into a January night, but the feather bed held its own warmth close, and Anders's presence beside her added its share, and within a few minutes the sharp edge of the cold had gone out of the sheets entirely. Through the small gap where the shutter did not sit quite flush against the frame, a thin blade of starlight lay across the floorboards, unmoving, and somewhere below the wind pressed once, steadily, against the corner of the house, and then eased, the whole building absorbing it the way it had absorbed every winter wind for 3 generations before this one. She lay a while listening to the small, ordinary sounds of the house settling for the night, the last tick of the cooling stove below, a creak of old timber adjusting itself to the cold, Anders's breathing beside her lengthening by degrees into the slow rhythm of sleep. Her body carried the day in it plainly now, the ache across her shoulders from the wheel, the warmth still lingering in her hands from the byre, the particular loose tiredness that came only from a day spent entirely in motion, one task folding into the next without a gap between them. She thought, briefly and without urgency, of tomorrow's washing, and of the wood that would want bringing in again before the week was out, and of Sigrid's letter still waiting in the cupboard drawer to be read once more some evening soon. None of it pressed on her. It simply waited, patient as the snow outside, for a day that had not yet arrived. The frost thickened on the window by slow degrees, spreading its white ferns further across the black glass, and the last coals in the stove below settled once, quietly, into their bed of ash. The quilts lay heavy and warm across her, weighted the way only a true winter blanket could weigh, pressing the whole of the day's cold decisively away. Outside, the valley held its long dark. The byre settled, the stabber standing patient on its posts, the whole small cluster of buildings breathing out its low, steady warmth into the vast surrounding cold, like something alive and sleeping. Marit's eyes closed and did not open again, and the house around her stood quiet and dark and entirely at peace, waiting as it always waited for the sun to come back over the eastern ridge and begin the whole good ordinary day again.